Alright, so this guy was just dropped off at my house. It appears to be a Honda Ruckus. It was dropped off and asked if I could see if I could get it running. I know nothing else about it. Looks like somebody had the dashboard off here. Possibly they might have been looking at the battery, which looks old. There is a key here, which is good. Looks like 4,978 miles are on this thing, so got ridden a little bit. I'll start diagnosing, I'll check it over and see what we can come up with. Okay, this I believe is the fuel tank underneath here. Looks pretty ugly. Ooh. Now, be glad you don't have smell-o-vision. This really stinks. This gas is very varnished up, and you can see it's all gummy on the bottom side of the cap. So that definitely is going to need to get drained and cleaned out. But before I go through all the work of doing that, I think what I will do first, I'll disconnect the fuel line and I'll put a temporary tank on there and see what I can do if I can get it running off the temporary tank, because there's no point in trying to run through that thing and clean this tank all out if the motor doesn't run. Airflow doesn't look bad, and there doesn't appear to be any mouse houses inside here, so that's a good sign. The carburetor seems to be underneath here. It looks like there's some bolts holding this plastic panel on, and this seat frame comes off easily enough. So I'm going to pop this stuff all off so I have better access to see what's going on inside this thing. Alright, we have a better idea of what's going on inside here now. Got a good look at the fuel tank there. Looks like the carburetor is up here. So I'll do a little tracing of some lines. Spark plugs there. What I want to do is I want to make sure I disconnect the fuel line before I even try kicking this over, because I don't want to suck up any of this bad gas into the carb. Okay, it appears, I believe this is an electric fuel pump. Down inside here there's wires going to it, and it looks like the fuel line comes in this side of the fuel pump and then is pumped up through this line here and goes into the carburetor there. A little bit of simple green, some spraying it off with the hose. I can see kind of better what's going on, where these lines are going. Cleaned up a little bit of the dirt, blew some of the mouse poop out of this thing. I'm going to let this dry off, and then the next step I would think is going to be pulling this carburetor off and cleaning that out, because I'm sure if the gas tank's that varnished, I'm sure the carb's varnished up too. Okay, I'm back working on this Honda. I got a little bit more info from the guy who dropped it off. He said it was sitting for at least 2 years, which would explain the bad gas. He says it pops off on starter fluid. So I have rigged up some jumper cables from a good battery to this battery that's in here, and I'm going to give it a shot to see if see if that's in fact true before I start taking anything apart. So I'm going to put you on the tripod here, and we're going to see if it pops off on the starter fluid. So we're going to give it a little shot, and we're going to come over here, hold the power on, turn the key, fuel pump is clicking, brake in, and start. Okay, so it does actually start. That's actually really good news. So now that we know that it'll start, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to disconnect the fuel pump from the fuel tank and see if it'll run on fresh gas. I still think I'm going to have to pull this carb and clean it, so I might do that first, but I'll bring you back when I get a little bit taken apart. So the fuel line's coming out of the bottom of the tank. It's hitting an inline fuel filter before it hits the fuel pump, which is a good sign. I'm going to take this little clamp and clamp off the fuel line, and then I'm going to remove it. Okay, what I have rigged up here, a little gas tank from a lawnmower running to the fuel pump. The carburetor still has to come out though, because the throttle's sticking. It still will just start on the ether, but it definitely is going to be gummed up in there after looking how bad the gas was. So I'm going to be pulling this off. So we're going to start taking that stuff apart now. So it looks like we have our air intake hose we got to take off, and we have to take off where it connects into the intake. So we're going to take these clamps off, disconnect all these vent hoses. This throttle position sensor needs to come off, and the fuel line down here. Also disconnect the throttle. So that's the parts we're going to be working on now. So there's two coolant lines here, in and out. Fuel line is here. On this side we have a breather, and then we have a throttle position sensor, and I think this one's in auto choke. So we'll bring this over to the bench and take it apart and see what's inside. Okay, the inside of the bowl is not terrible. I was expecting far worse than this. So that's actually a good sign. There's some sediment in there and there's some varnish in there. We're going to clean that out with some carb cleaner. This is our float. Then we have our jets here. These are going to come out and we'll clean them up. Overall, it doesn't look too bad. So the float, there's a pin here we got to poke out. Pull this pin out. Our float's going to come out, and then this is our little valve. This is what stops the fuel from coming in when the carb bowl, as this, kind of like your toilet. When your toilet fills all the way up, shuts all the way off. When this float lifts up, it lets fuel in, and when it's full, it shuts it off. Okay, so these guys here, when you hold them up to the light, you can kind of see if it's clean or not. This one, I can see light through there, but it's not super good. So we're definitely going to clean that out. Okay, this jet here, I don't see any light through it. And this you got to clean out all these little holes. So I actually have some little fine wires we can poke through there and clean that out. Okay, this cover comes off. We have a spring and there's a diaphragm in here, so we got to be careful with this not to damage it. Okay, and then there's a needle here that we want to make sure that's clean also. Take some of this gum cutter, clean out all the jets, get everything cleaned up, and I'll bring you back when that's done. Alright, so I'm back on this Honda Ruckus. Carb cleaning went well. I got all the jets cleaned out. I let it soak overnight, reassembled it, and saved you the trouble of watching it go back in. Went back in the exact reverse as it came out. Okay, oil change is complete. All you need to change the oil on this thing is a 17mm wrench and a 17mm socket. It takes out 0.6 quarts of oil, which is like, I think, 19 ounces roughly. And there's that little screen in the front I pulled out. There was actually gasket material in there, which was kind of odd. This is an 03 model, and the oil is really dirty, and potentially that might be the original oil, so I'm sure it's going to like having new oil in it. All right, so the new fuel tank is here, so I'm going to get everything reassembled back in. I swapped everything over from the old fuel tank to the new fuel tank, the sending unit or low fuel sensor, and I'm ready to put it in. I did change the filter down here. It's a little inline. I swapped that out. Okay, fuel tank is wrestled back in there. I got my fuel filter and fuel line hooked up. Transferring some gas from my temporary tank into the permanent tank. You have to, I was struggling in the beginning because I forgot how the lines are routed. But these lines actually, the plastic tray goes in first. And the lines, the brake line, throttle, and the wiring harness actually go through on the top side of this trough, not underneath where I had them. So once I figured that out, it went a lot smoother. So I'm going to get this gas topped off, and then I'll see if it fires, and if it fires, I'll put the rest of the plastics back on. Alright, so that pretty much puts it all back together. When the customer dropped it off, these bolts that hold this cowling on were removed already, so I gotta see if he's got the bolts or if I can find some other metric bolts for that. So this is just on there loose right now. Everything else went back as it should. So I'll do a little more test driving before I give it back, but I think she's ready to go. So thanks for following along on this project, and we'll see you on the next video.